Do you sometimes feel that world history is moving at warp speed these days? Well, certainly I do. When I look in my news feed, I feel that the tectonic plates are moving and that the world that I grew up in is changing very, very fast. There's no doubt that we are moving into a new era of unforgiving geopolitical competition, where Europe is going to have to take a fresh look at its alliances and think very carefully about how we compete and how we protect ourselves in a world that is rapidly changing. That's why we in Eurelectric have taken a deep look at how to redefine energy security in what we call the age of electricity. And let's pause a moment on the age of electricity. Why is it that we feel that we're entering into an era where the role of electricity is becoming ever more important? Well, the first reason for this is that we see a very close and unbreakable link between decarbonization on the one hand and electrification on the other hand. So decarbonization, the act of taking out carbon emissions from the economy, and electrification, the act of progressively replacing fossil fuels in the economy with clean electricity. Those two processes are very closely linked and will continue to be so. Therefore, we believe that the age of climate change, the age of climate action, is one of electrification, hence the era of electricity. The tectonic plates of geopolitics are moving very fast. US, the traditional ally of Europe throughout the period since the Second World War, is having a new administration with new political priorities in the energy space and also in foreign policy. When it comes to competitiveness, they are looking to unleash what they call American energy and make the best of the big reserves they have of fossil fuels. And on the other hand, as a contrast, we see China that is doubling down on a path towards a more electrified economy and their attempts to build up a competitive advantage in the clean tech space. Now, Europe is somewhere in between that, and the real question for us is, how do we compete? How do we protect ourselves in a world where we can no longer rely on what we used to take as given truths? In this new world, where climate change remains one of the most serious threats to the well-being of mankind, and by the way, to the planet as well, we have to take serious, consistent, and swift action. What that means is that we need to double down on decarbonization, and what that means is, again, electrification. We need to progressively replace fossil fuels in our transport sector, in our buildings, and in industry with clean electricity. There is no way around that. What that means is that electricity demand will be rising. This is also a good idea from an energy security perspective. And why so? Well, since we have no fossil fuel reserves in Europe, our indigenous resource is the electricity that we can produce in a clean and carbon-free manner, whether it's with renewables or with nuclear or other ways of clean production. Now, when our society starts to rely more on electricity, it's also very clear that electricity needs to be reliable. And that's why the new paradigm for energy security for Europe is tied very closely to the notion of security supply in electricity. Let's have a closer look at security supply in electricity. Here I want to present you with a technical perspective and a political perspective. The technical perspective is what the experts are assessing when they look at whether we have the right infrastructure, whether we will have a loss of load, whether that value of lost load is big or small, and how many instances we may or may not experience. We may conduct that assessment according to all rules and with excellence, and even so, not be able to capture what politicians care about when it comes to security of supply. Politicians need to be re-elected, so they care about the public debate. They care about the perceived energy prices. They care about the actual energy prices. They care about big events that occur on the energy system. And what we see increasingly is that the methodology we use to assess security of supply in the electricity system is becoming disconnected from the realities that politicians have to deal with. That's not because the methodology was bad to begin with, it's because the world has changed fundamentally. What we're seeing in the world around us now is that the threats are literally piling up. We have a hot war on the European continent. In 2022, the Russians initiated a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and they have been throwing bombs at the energy infrastructure of Ukraine ever since. We're seeing an increase in the so-called hybrid attacks in Europe. What that means is attacks on critical infrastructure, whether it's data cables, gas interconnectors, or electricity cables. Time and again, these are being damaged, and it's happening too often for this to be a series of coincidences. Cyber attacks are on the rise. We are seeing more cyber attacks, and we're seeing more successful cyber attacks. This is something that significantly impacts the operations of companies and of customers and their guaranteed electricity. We have more occurrences of espionage. We see drones, unidentified drones at our wind parks, at our grid installations, even above our nuclear power plants. And last but not least, we have climate change. We have more and more frequent occurrences of extreme weather. Just this winter, it was the enormous storm in Ireland, and every year in the past few years, we can go back and find instances of torrential rains or droughts, heat waves, etc., that are putting a serious strain on the system. In fact, the rising temperature in itself is a challenge for the electricity system. It's putting stress on the grid infrastructure. It is putting stress on the installations. It is requiring us to cool installations more than we used to. And at the same time, we are conducting a technologically challenging transformation. We are decentralizing our system. We are adding hundreds of gigawatts of renewable capacities, many of which are connected to the medium and low voltage levels. So that in itself is also changing the system and changing the equation for security of supply, which has normally been conducted at the TSO level, so the high voltage level. We're also digitizing. We are introducing sensors, digital solutions, AI to optimize the system, make it work better. But what that also means is that we're opening potential flanks for cyber crooks. Last but not least, we're decarbonizing. What that means is that we're gradually pulling off the conventional plants from the system. This is a necessary exercise in order for us to reduce carbon emissions, but it comes with implications for security of supply, because those big plants, they are providing the stability to the system, as it were. A big power plant has big spinning masses. It has a generator, a turbine that weighs tons and tons, and that provides inertia to the system, which provides frequency control. And those plants also have the so-called black start capabilities that are necessary for us to reboot the system should we have a blackout. Now, in the long run, this is all going to be fine. The point about security supply is that we have to make the system work today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. An energy security strategy based on electrification is an investment in the future. We have very limited fossil fuel reserves, and therefore the continued imports of something that we burn straight away is going to leave us with a lot of cost in the long run. Therefore, replacing those operational costs with investments in a cleaner system that stands for 20, 30, 40 years is a very good idea also from a broader economic perspective. What it requires is that we are able to run the electricity system reliably. And Here we are at a key point for our study. In order for this to work, however, we need all hands on deck, technologically speaking. We need the renewables. Those are a key source of indigenous energy for Europe, but we need to balance those with all means available. We need to balance them with storage and DSR, but we also need firm plants, big power plants that can act in a firm or flexible manner. And last but not least, of course, we need to make sure that we have the necessary infrastructure. It is really a key point of this study that we need all hands on deck. Diversity is a strength. And let me explain why on the basis of this chart, which is really interesting. In order to decode this chart, you need to first look at the blue bars and then compare with the greens. The blue are from last year, the greens are from this year. If we start with the renewables in the middle, we see a massive growth in solar and a moderate growth of wind energy. If we look towards the left of the chart, we have the technologies that eventually need to be phased out. That's the lignite, it's the coal, and they're more or less stable. Then we have the gas and the nuclear, and again, relatively stable. If we then look to the right side of the renewables, we have the new sources of flexibility, the batteries and the demand side response. Look at those bars and see how small they are compared to the amount of renewables we have in the system. What this means essentially is that there's a huge potential for growth in these two areas. It also means that they're not going to back up the system anytime soon. And if we move on to the next chart, there's an even more important point here. On this chart, we're showing the flexibility needs in 2025 and 2030 and 2040, but across different time frames. Because flexibility is not a one-size-fits-all. We have daily flexibility, we have weekly flexibility, and we have seasonal flexibility. And storage, demand-side response can help with the daily flexibility, but we actually need different kit, different types of power plants, different solutions in order to cover the weekly and the seasonal storage. And now look how the flexibility needs are evolving between 2025 and 2030. This is absolutely daunting. A tripling of the daily flexibility needs, a doubling of the seasonal, and a significant rise in the weekly. What this means essentially is that we can only square this circle if we invest in all the vectors of flexibility. And why we need much more flexibility, what we've actually done in the last 7 years is that we have phased out the flexible power plants. Another key point of this study is that we need to take very seriously the fact that we have different types of flexibility solutions in different regions of Europe. Again, flexibility is not a one-size-fits-all. This comes with a very positive message, namely that if we work together, we are strong. If everyone does its own thing, they are left with their own flexibility sources. They are less strong, less resilient. If we work together and leverage our joint resources, we are going to have a better equation for all of Europe. So we need to work with what we have. We need to use the hydro plants, the nuclear plants, and the gas plants that we have, and we have to invest in more of them. And then we have to invest and accelerate the use of the new sources of flexibility. Storage needs to grow by a factor 4 up until 2030. And demand-side response really needs to take off as well. Remember, if we adjust the demand side in accordance with what we actually have available in terms of generation, that is probably the cheapest way we can provide flexibility. And I want you to take a careful look at this chart, because this shows that implementation is becoming very urgent. Now, all policymakers really like the idea of increased demand-side flexibility, but when it comes to actually implementing the rules, it's not going that fast. There are 70 provisions in existing legislation that need to be implemented that could help make things better. And on this chart, you're basically seeing how it's going. And without providing too much detail, we can just say that when it comes to DSR, we're not doing great, because in this case, red means bad. Last but not least, we need a strong infrastructure to connect the dots of this great European electricity system. And that's why we believe that the mantra of European energy policy should be grids, baby, grids. We need to anticipate the future when we invest in grids. We need to get ready for a future with much more electricity demand, much more complex flows in the system, and we need to modernize that aging infrastructure of ours to take it into the 21st century and help it underpin security of supply in the age of electricity. So tying all these things together, what we're coming at is a new paradigm for security of supply, one that factors in those new macro risks that we're facing and integrates them in the way we work with planning, investing, and operating the electricity system. We need to plan for the unexpected. We need to be aware of the physical threats, the cyber threats, and the extreme weather that's coming at us. And increasingly, we need to de-risk supply chains, because we cannot afford that foreign powers are able to interfere in our operation on the basis of equipment they have installed on our system. That comes with a cost, but that's something we have to accept. Now, a key point of our study is that we need to integrate those new aspects in the way we plan the system. We need to plan in a broader manner where we integrate those new risks. We need to plan in an integrated manner where we plan across vectors. And then we need to plan in a more granular manner where we look at the detailed flexibility needs at all levels of the grid. Then we need to invest for resilience. That means we need to continue to roll out the renewables, but we also urgently have to invest in all the flexibility solutions and the firm solutions available and that are needed for the system. And then we need to invest in the infrastructure. Secondly, we need to invest in resilience. That means investing in the renewables that provide us with that indigenous resource, but also very much in the firm and flex solutions that provide stability and balance to the system. We need to invest in the infrastructure, and then we need to invest in security. What that means is we need to avoid single points of failure. We need to have a certain level of redundancy in the system, and we need regulators to recognize that resilience comes with a cost. Last but not least, we need to operate with efficiency and increased situational awareness. Now, efficiency is about having good market arrangements that allow us to hedge properly also across borders, allows us to balance the system on a daily basis with the use of all technologies, and also in a way that allows us to send local signals to customers to switch on and off in order to use the system in the best possible way. But I want to spend just a minute on the point about situational awareness. If we are operating this system in a context where we have to expect more drone espionage, more cyber attacks, and more direct attacks on our system, we need to operate with a different type of awareness. People need to keep their eyes open, and we need to exercise for situations where we are under attack. This is something that all utilities need to take on, and there's some very interesting cases across Europe from utilities that have been most exposed to this. So situational awareness and contact to the authorities on a daily basis in order to ensure secure operations and avoid attacks is going to be important in this new era of intense geopolitical competition. This is, in essence, the new paradigm of security supply that we believe is the right way forward. We also acknowledge that we are in a time with moving targets. Things are changing very rapidly on the ground, and therefore we're interested in having a conversation with all the other stakeholders in the space, not to lecture them on what needs to be done, but to learn from them and solve these problems together as we go along. So with that, this is our pitch for energy security in the age of electricity. Thank you.